common teacher fear is, what if the student results are not good enough? I always talk about triangulation, so using multiple sources of information when we make decisions. So it's important to recognize that every data set has noise, human decision-making noise in it, both from us and from young people.
You're listening to Around the School Table, hosted by me, Steve Davis, and proudly powered by Zuno Suite. We'll be bringing together the many voices shaping primary and secondary education across Australia, from principals and teachers to education thought leaders and system innovators. Whether you're in the classroom, the staff room, or the boardroom, this is your podcast to be informed, inspired, and connected. Today on Around the School Table, we're joined by Dr Selena Fisk, a data storyteller who helps schools and systems become data-informed, not data-driven. A former maths and PE teacher in Australia and the UK, Selena's PhD explored student perceptions of feedback, and she now works with middle and senior leaders to build cultures where data prompts better questions, not just compliance. She's the author of several books, including I'm Not a Numbers Person, and is known for turning dashboards into human stories that lead to action. And in the conversation we're about to have, Selena will help teachers and leaders make sense of data without drowning in it, how to use it to find strengths as well as gaps, and how to talk responsibly about NAPLAN and My School, and how to build an ethical, curious data culture that starts with people and not spreadsheets. Selena, welcome to Around the School Table.
Thanks for having me, Steve. Well, that's a big promise of a podcast episode, isn't it?
I like to set the bar high.
Yeah, I love it. It's awesome.
Now, you began as a maths and PE teacher, which itself would be a wonderful conversation to have, although there's a lot of maths in sport, in both Australia and the UK. But it's South London where I want to start, because you experienced a system where teachers were held professionally accountable for a single metric, which was graduation outcomes. Mm-hmm. How did that environment shape your early understanding of both the power and the potential danger of using data in schools?
Yeah, it was a bit of a baptism of fire, to be honest, because I came from teaching in Australia before that, and I hadn't really had much experience with data. So it was a really steep learning curve. I got my role as head of PE, and it was made very clear to me immediately that my job was to increase the pass rate, and it was that one annual metric. And I am, being PE trained and pretty sporty, I'm quite competitive. So I was like, okay, if you set me a target, I'm going to try and beat that. And, we were lucky enough that we were able to do that. And I guess at the same time, what I was seeing was this really negative use of data across the school. So it's kind of shaped my my work now, because there's things that I really advocate for, and then I guess really specific actions and cultural pieces that we have to strongly advocate against, and we have to deliberately, I guess, construct the environment and the culture that supports people to have really good human conversations about the numbers, whereas over there, it was just numbers. Like, it wasn't about the kids, it wasn't about the humans, it was like, you just have to hit this almost like a business KPI. And if you do, then you've done your job. And if not, then, to be honest, people were performance managed if they didn't hit their targets. So really ruthless.
I just had this image, because when I grew up, principals had a cane in their office to smack people who had deviated. It's almost like you're painting a picture where the cane was replaced with a string of data, which was there to be used to punish rather than encourage.
Absolutely. It was... it was not stick or carrot, because there was no real carrot. It was just, you've done your job, but 100%. For me, I regularly, I think it was a fortnightly basis, had to meet with my leadership team and be able to provide evidence of all of the intervention strategies that I had put in place in the previous 2 weeks to get my kids over the line. So they were most interested in the kids who were borderline, kind of DC borderline, because they were obviously the ones that were going to impact that overall result. And so I had to be able to document and prove the work that I had been doing with them to get them over the line. So really high pressure, to be honest, quite a toxic work environment. I mean, I was in the matrix. I felt like I I was playing the game and there was parts of it that I was loving. It wasn't until I stepped out and I was like, whoa, there was so much about that was so bad. So that informs my work now.
Isn't that, though, just before we leave the PE thing, isn't that the ecosystem that leads itself later in a World Cup to having the president of your country step in to get a red card wiped off the table because it's results, and it's none of the bits in between, if I'm not too political in saying that?
Not too political at all. I think there are a whole lot of issues there that we don't have time to unpack. But it's just that pursuit of a result, almost to the detriment of everything else, and zero care about everything else other than just getting this result. So yeah, 100%.
All right, I'll come back to your PhD now because you explored student perceptions of feedback. And one insight that stood out was that many students actually wanted to know where they sat and they wanted to ask questions about the results. Can you unpack for us what students are really asking for when they want more visibility of their learning data? And also, at the same time, let's smuggle in a second one, how teachers can make those conversations constructive rather than discouraging.
Yeah, so my doctorate was actually an EdD, so a Doctor of Education, which is a slight difference. It contributes to practice rather than thinking, and it's just important to point that out because it matters. It does matter to some people. But I guess that's where my findings were really practical and where I was able to say, look, students are saying that they want to know where their result sits in the cohort and in the context of every other learner because students were saying to me, well, it gives me good information about where I'm at, and I had students say things like, you could tell me that I'm getting a B+, but that's I take that feedback really differently if that puts me at the top of the class versus the bottom of the class. And so I had students saying that, and any doctorate is a small sample size, and I interviewed 40 students, but in that 40 students, I had one student who said, I don't like the comparison to other students, and I asked her why, and a common teacher fear is, what if the student results are not good enough, and what they already know they're low, why would we kind of almost rub it in? So that's the teacher narrative that we often hear, and I still hear that today. But this one student who didn't want it said, I'm actually topping, it was 2 arts subjects. She said, I'm currently duxing both of those subjects. And she said, I'm actually not all that bothered whether or not I dux it, but my best mate is coming second to me, and it's all she wants to do is to dux these subjects. And I feel like anytime I'm compared to her, it's a reminder to her that she hasn't achieved her goal. So, yep, one student, but very different narrative to what I guess we hear. Now, did you want to kind of jump in on that? I know I haven't fully answered your question.
No,
but
I was fascinated with that exact story because that is a case of taking the eye off the ball. When here's a student happily engaged in what they're doing, but because another one is so focused on that result, it poisons the well when that comparative status gets brought up, which wobbles both of them.
Yeah, and I didn't get to interview her best mate. I would have loved to in hindsight. It would have been really interesting. But yeah, it was more that this student I did interview said she felt bad that she was beating her friend. So it's really different, I guess, to what we generally talk about. Our kids who are low, they know they're low, definitely. It is hard. It's really tricky to kind of think about that comparison, given that students, obviously in my study, were saying that they're really for it. There's also ways that you can do it that's not as intense or confronting. If you have a big tail, if you have one student who's sitting a long way from others, then there's obviously potentially a reason to not do it in that context. Like, it's not an all or nothing kind of decision to make. And as I shared kind of at the beginning of this conversation or this question response, it's like at the end of the day, kids want to know where they kind of sit in the group. One of the other things that I think I found really interesting about those findings was that students were saying they really value written feedback. And this research was, it's obviously old by the time you publish, it's old, and then it's kind of been a few years since then. But at the time, all of the students I interviewed were in schools that had laptops and were often submitting electronic drafts. And kids were still saying to me at that point, they were saying, we prefer hard copy, handwritten draft notes because we're not very good at tracking changes and things get moved all over the page. And it's actually much easier to make sense of the feedback and the adjustments when it's written on a piece of paper. And then they said, we also want to be able to have the opportunity to go and question our teachers and ask for further information or clarification. But again, I mean, I was lucky. I interviewed a lot of phenomenal young people, but there were kids who said to me, I actually feel bad going and asking my teacher for clarification after they seem to have put in so much work to the written feedback. Even though they were saying, look, it's actually more effective for me to be able to kind of do both. But they said if they felt like it wasn't always available to them or like they should go and ask the follow-up questions.
Teachers themselves, they're often taught how to collect data, but I think what you're positing is they're not necessarily taught how to use it to make decisions. If you imagine a teacher sitting in front of a dashboard full of numbers, where's a useful starting point to try and make sense of what we then do constructively with this information?
Yeah, so the first thing is always, I guess, what are you looking for? Like, what's your hypothesis that you're going in with, and what's kind of, I guess, the angle that you're looking at that data through? But then also the second part of that is, what data do you value the most to help you answer that question? Because a dashboard or a platform where we can look at so many different sources of information in so many different ways, we've actually got to make decisions about what we value and what's actually really useful for us. And then that's what we double down on. And I always talk about triangulation, so using multiple sources of information when we make decisions. And so it's important to recognize that, every data set has noise, human decision-making noise in it, both from us and from young people. And every data set is biased and every instrument is biased in many ways. So for that reason, no data set's perfect. And sometimes there's a perception that it can be really black and white like it was in the UK. But that's just not reality. And actually data's a lot more grey than I guess we might kind of expect. So it's being able to look at, say, 3 to 5 data sets and go, well, what's the majority of the information telling me about what this student needs, what this class needs, what the cohort needs, and maybe it might be, the entire school. Because if we're then seeing the patterns or the trends across multiple sources, then we know that that's a thing, and we can hold that perspective and the confirmation of the hypothesis, like with conviction. And then when we have that good evidence that's informing decisions, the actions we take or the next steps are more likely to be successful. So I think we're getting better at the teaching people and having those conversations about how do you look at data. But sometimes there's a real lack of confidence, or people are unsure about, well, what do I do with that information now that I have it, and what could those next steps be? And I guess my main thing that I would add is it doesn't have to be massive. It can be minor tweaks. It can be a conversation. It can be changing the questions or the focus of a lesson. That's all data-informed practice when you use data to shift those decisions.
And also in what you were saying, if I heard you correctly, is there's a little bit of expectation setting when you first look at this data and you're triangulating, etc. If our expectation isn't that we're going to get an instant answer, but it might throw up some different nuance in the questions, is that's a good thing to have a volley after volley of some different questions to get to a more informed place. Did I get that right?
Yeah, 100%. One of the things I often say is data never tells you what to do. It's just the prompt to get you thinking, as you say, and to ask curious questions and to think slowly and deliberately about what the different kind of reasons are and what the possible actions could be. So yeah, absolutely. Curiosity is, I guess, a characteristic or a trait that I'm really doubling down on at the moment in my own research. I'm really fascinated by it because ultimately, for me, it's almost the number one thing that if people are curious about the data, then they're more likely to use it well. Where if they're really closed and not curious, they might do something for compliance or to tick a box or to say, oh yeah, we did something about that, but it won't be genuine.
I want to pick up on the compliance thing because you work with middle and senior leaders to create frameworks to make data use more consistent. So Can you talk us through, what does a strong, practical data conversation sound like in a school leadership meeting that perhaps is held back from being a compliance exercise? What's your way of painting that picture?
Yeah, awesome question. There's a couple of parts to it. I think the meeting would have started with some of the data being shared prior to the meeting so that people have time to digest it if they want that extra time or they need that extra time. What we want, if we're having a data conversation, is we actually want people engaging in being able to answer curious, well-formulated questions in the moment, not be sitting there thinking, hang on, what does that chart say? What does that mean? I need a minute to kind of process. We actually want people in that conversation having, I guess, much higher order thinking conversations than just reading and analysing the data. So sometimes presenting that and giving it to them beforehand. At the same time, if we do that and we set, whether or not it's before the meeting or during the meeting, and we're sharing the data set, we actually want to frame the conversation around some key questions. So those key questions would be around maybe curiosities about what the data's telling us or what the triangulated information is telling us, wondering why and what some of those contributing factors might be. I love the Eisenhower matrix from 7 Habits of Highly Effective People to think about data. So what are the trends and the insights we're seeing that are most urgent and important for us to address? So there has to be some level of prioritization. And then it has to fall into that, then the next step, which is, well, what do we do about this now? And whether or not this is an executive conversation, whether it's a middle leader having a conversation with their team, or whether it's even like a teaching team kind of talking about their own data.
Dibbles gives teachers powerful insight into early literacy, but Student Maps helps turn that insight into action. By bringing Dibbles data, along with every other assessment your school uses, into one clear visual dashboard, Student Maps helps teachers identify reading risks, group students for targeted support, and track progress over time. No scattered spreadsheets, no data sitting unused. Just clearer learning plans, better interventions, and stronger conversations about every student's growth. Student Maps, making literacy data visible, practical, and actionable.
The things I see and the challenge we have is often people get caught in the analysis conversation and they don't necessarily get to the prioritizing quickly enough and then don't always get to the action. And that's ultimately where young people are actually benefited when we're talking about, well, what does this mean for me tomorrow in my classroom or for this unit now that I know that thing? So I guess I really advocate for, and you mentioned frameworks, like I really advocate for conversation frameworks or templates that guide people through that process. In the same way that we provide exemplars and we model new skills and learning to young people in our schools, I think of educators in the same way. Like if we want them to get to a particular point in a conversation, we've got to lead them there.
How sweet it is to my ears to hear the Eisenhower matrix mentioned and some of these timeless things that despite how much technology we have, there's still a remnant of deep human thinking that perseveres through the ages.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's such a cracking model. And it's, I always say to people when I present, it's like such a good life frame and day-to-day frame, but it's really useful when we're looking at data too.
Now, I believe you're based in Victoria.
I am.
This year, which is 2026, there was a government school software panel that limited the number of approved software packages for use when interrogating sensitive student data. And if I'm correct, at one end you've got something like Excel, at the other end you have something like Student Maps. Mm-hmm. How can leaders make sure that their systems are helping teachers see what matters rather than simply creating more information they have to manage?
Yeah, for me, one of the things I often work with school leaders around is the development of a data plan. And so a data plan moves us from, I guess, the perception or the view that we want our educators to be using data to inform their practice. And it moves into a much more tangible, practical document or template around, actually, if you're teaching in year 4 or if you're teaching year 8 science, these are some of the expectations that we have around your data use and the data that you have access to. clarifying some of those expectations is really useful for people, because if we've got people coming into our school and maybe they haven't used some of the assessment instruments before, or they're not overly familiar with them, or they're new to the technology, whatever that might be, it's like we actually support our people by providing that clarity around, well, actually, this is what we want you to do. I guess the other piece I would add to that, given that you kind of referenced the tech in the question, is the challenge with any tech, whatever the tech stack is, and obviously I work with a range of different schools and systems across the country and also internationally, so every combination and permutation of tech is different. The main challenge and the main thing that is consistent to all of those is the ability to attempt to streamline data access as much as possible. We know that if teachers, leaders, whoever it is, have to log on, hypothetically, if you had 10 different options, like if you wanted to look at this type of data, you go here, another type of data, you go to this portal, another type of data, you go to this one. They're all presented in different ways. They have different visualizations. They're not easy to triangulate across. And it's just hurdle after hurdle after hurdle. We're actually making the job harder for our teachers. And so whatever kind of, as I say, whatever tech stack looks like in your school, the challenge for leaders is how do we simplify this process as much as possible, not only from the expectations in the data plan perspective about what we want, but also how do we do that from a technical perspective and platform perspective to make it as streamlined as we can.
Yes, because the last thing you want is headwinds when you've got a certain amount of time to get in and interrogate some data and look for joining the dots. So that makes sense, yeah.
Yeah, and every different platform will often have different logins, and then people forget passwords, and and then you spend the first half an hour of a meeting trying to get into all the dashboards that you need to. So more streamlined the better.
I think I could say it's a commonly held assumption that data is useful for finding gaps or problems. And I think I'm also right in saying that you have a slightly different position. You like schools to be able to use data to identify success, strengths, practices worth spreading across a school. Can you talk to that for us, that mindset shift?
Yeah. You're absolutely right. So the idea of celebration in any data set, in any triangulation, there's always things that have actually gone really well and areas to celebrate. So whether that be for individual students and we can recognise them and celebrate the change that's taken place. I used to, in my classroom practice, look at my class and the amount of change that had taken place for them, and I'd big them up and celebrate with them, and sometimes even have kind of little extrinsic motivated like pizza party type things if we achieved a particular thing or made progress. But at a school level as well, we can look at school awards, like how do we recognise improvement in whether it's grade point average. There's a school I worked with in my Data Champions program. They run not the most improved grade point average, but the students who have got almost the grade point average PB, like personal best of all time. So things like that, where it's recognizing where kids and classes, cohorts, teachers, whatever it might be, have actually, I guess, really excelled and done really well. And as you kind of said in the question, it's then the ability to go, okay, how do we reflect on that? And what can I do with that knowledge now that I have it? So it's the same thinking and process that I talked about before, but it's through the lens of what are the most urgent and important positives that come out of the data, and therefore what can we do with that? How can we spread that? How do we share it? How do we learn from that? How can we kind of replicate that? Or is it worth attempting to replicate that elsewhere? The other part of that is the piece around progress. So I often talk about the benefit of having 2 or more data points, which then allows us to talk to the shift that has taken place and the change that's taken place. So I work with a lot of schools that are now recognizing, the most improved readers, for example, or students who've improved the most in numeracy, or students whose attendance has increased the most. And while that has been something, or we've I guess, recognized or awarded consistent effort or whatever it might be at assemblies, we can use the data to, I guess, inform some of those almost school-wide recognitions and change. And often the kids who are making the most progress in our schools are the ones who are struggling quite a bit. if you're an A student and you move to an A plus, that change is not as significant as if a student goes from a D minus to a C minus. That's a complete change in application, in effort, in achievement. So there's a lot of amazing opportunities to recognise the progress that kids are making, regardless of kind of where they sit on the achievement scale.
Yeah, to me it seems like it's unlocking the power. There's a psychological principle, I'm not exactly sure what it's called, but it's to do with internal consistency with the story we have about ourselves. And in this situation, if I get singled out as becoming a stronger reader, I take that on board that, I'm a stronger reader. I'll read more, which to me seems like the positive side of the coin than hearing how you're failing in that field.
Absolutely. And I taught a student called Luke who had very average results in maths and had for a number of years. And when I went and looked at his NAPLAN and PAT assessment data, he had actually achieved very high results in every assessment he had done. And so my conversation with Luke was then, tell me about what's going on in maths, why is what I'm seeing in class not matching these external assessments? He'd actually never seen the external assessment results. And so to your point, he just said, I always just found maths really boring. I was like, well, actually, you're very good at it. And he had exceptionally high reading comprehension and literacy results as well. And I guess he's one of my favourite stories to tell because it really shifted his identity as a learner from grade 10 through to grade 12. And he started to see himself not as somebody who was just bored at school, as to, actually, this is easy because I can do this. And, stretch was really good for him. It was awesome to kind of watch him evolve over a few years.
I shouldn't be surprised that you brought NAPLAN up because NAPLAN in my school, you talk quite strongly about these things, about how data can be misrepresented, particularly when schools are compared without any regard for their communities or their socioeconomic context. What do you think would make more responsible public conversations about school data look like? Well, how would we do that better?
Oh, that is a cracking question. That's really hard. The progress or growth conversation is the one I think that is better than the achievement. As you say, often the schools that are named in the, some of our lovely online media promote the top 5 schools in each state and territory each NAPLAN year. That's really problematic because it is often the schools with higher ICSIA ratings. It's often high fee paying schools. And I do so much work with schools in far north Queensland, in the Northern Territory. I work with 2 schools on the Tiwi Islands. These are phenomenal educators working just as hard as any other educator across the country. And the work that they're doing to create change and lead progress and shift young people's literacy and numeracy is phenomenal. And they're never represented in those conversations nationwide. So I guess the problem with ranking, there's a few problems with ranking, but one of them is some of the data that's actually reported is incorrect. So I've worked with schools who have been named and said that's actually not our data. And I've worked with schools who have not been named in the media who've said our data is actually better than the numbers that they're reporting in the media. So I certainly have questions about where that's coming from in the first place. But a far better conversation is one of progress and growth, and even highlighting case studies of schools that have really shifted. We're not here, we don't do our jobs to improve NAPLAN results. Like, that's not why any of us became teachers. But it can be, again, a beautiful example of how our educators are shifting things for young people and improving their literacy and numeracy.
I wonder what that does to the ecosystem in those schools that do consistently rank high. Does that take you back to South London, where they get trapped through their own success, in inverted commas, to have the pressure on keeping those NAPLAN results high?
It's interesting because the ones I've worked with that are in that category, like, it's kind of a nice to have, but in many ways, some of them are not all that interested in it because it's just one data set. It's a 40-minute writing assessment. It's a 40-minute multi-choice assessment. Like, it's it's a snapshot in time, and I think many of those educators would actually prefer that the media were reporting stories of the phenomenal educators and what they're doing in their school rather than reporting a number against their name. And I know that's making a massive generalization, but particularly the secondaries I work with, NAPLAN takes a backseat, maybe a backseat of the bus even, compared to, say, Year 12 exit results and what they want their kids to be able to access post-schooling. So NAPLAN is not up there. As much as it's nice to be named in the paper, it's definitely not their priority. That's not why we're doing what we're doing.
So any journalists hearing this, I think, follow up Dr. Selena Fisk, and you can write the best NAPLAN story ever. I spent a lot of time up in the Northern Territory, so when you mentioned Tiwi Islands, it caught my attention. You did some work there with the schools exploring attendance and engagement and uncovered some important cultural issues around secondary schooling. Can you just give us a little taste of what that involved?
Yeah, I need to do a massive shout out to Rhett and Kelly, who are the principals of the primary and the secondary Catholic schools on Tiwi, because it's their work and the way they've led their people, which has been absolutely phenomenal. In the secondary, one of the things that they, I guess, found was, attendance is dropping off, and attendance in any remote community is a challenge. So they were really curious about the data and worked out kind of ways of tracking that and worked out reasons why students were not coming to school. And they explored an option of actually splitting the Year 9 class into boys and girls class. And that obviously required more funding, more resourcing, but they gave it a go to see whether or not it would have an impact on attendance, and it has. And they have more students now in their senior pathway than ever before. I don't want to get this wrong, but I think it's like they have 3 or 4 times more students over a 2-year period in their senior pathway. It's something phenomenal like that. I can't remember exactly. But they listened to community. So community was saying to them, look, the young women shouldn't be in the same room at that age as the young men. And so they listened to the community, they tested it out, and they got an amazing result. As a consequence of both listening to the community, negotiating the timing and resources, and they just said, this thing is worth us investing in and testing. And I guess their hypothesis was proven right.
And measuring.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And having good baseline data right at the beginning, they were able to do that comparison and go, this is clearly having an impact.
All right. Just in closing, we did touch on this earlier, but I want to finish on it. There's a quote I have of you. Isn't that wonderful when you're about to have your words fed back to you?
I'm scared. I don't know what it is.
Data never tells you what to do. It's the prompt that gets you thinking.
Yeah.
For a school leader who does want to build a more confident and ethical data culture, what mindset shift do you want them to employ the most? What might change in their school once they do?
I think it's the things that we've spoken about. It's the curiosity as the leader. If the leader is not curious and they're not modeling curiosity, and if they're not vulnerable enough to say, I don't know what's going on here, or what other information do we have that could tell us a better story about this, or who's missing from the data. If they're not modeling those behaviours and that questioning, the staff are not going to feel safe enough to ask those questions when they're put in a similar situation. So it's really modeling from the top. What it looks like to be data informed, as you said in the introduction. So we're considering the context and multiple sources and all of that, and encouraging that then in other people. And I guess the encouragement of that then comes formally through that idea of templating and structuring conversations and guiding people through the inquiry. Lynn Sharrett says every meeting should start with data. And my little addition to that quote is every meeting should start with data that's relevant to the purpose of the meeting. So as leaders, when we're modeling, if the meeting is about X, it's okay, this is some of the evidence we have at the moment about the current state of play. These are the questions, or these are the decisions we need to make as a result. So the evidence should be embedded in all of those conversations along the way. It's not this bolt-on or add-on, okay, well, we have to have a data conversation. It permeates through those conversations all the time. We're making evidence-informed decisions, and we're using evidence to help us know what to do next. And that comes from the top.
Dr. Selena Fisk, thank you very much for joining me around the school table.
Thanks so much for having me.